Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Weed Management in a Year with Tight Herbicide Supplies. This webinar, as with the other 7 prior to today's date, are sponsored by the Crop Protection Network. Thank you, the Crop Protection Network, for bringing this webinar to you today free of charge. As always, we have a few housekeeping notes. First, if you have difficulty seeing your screen, please reach out to Lacey Edwardson, my colleague. Her phone number is 608-268-4953. She also will be your contact to answer any questions regarding the CEUs. This webinar is 30 minutes of length, so that's half a CEU continuing education credit in pest management. There is a questions portal. Please submit your questions for our speaker anytime during this webinar, and then I'll compile them and present them to Joe at the end of the session. Please note that this session is being recorded. You will have this recording in hand within about a week or two after today's date. That will come to you through email. And as always, watch out for future webinars coming up in the next few weeks. We have a carbon market series beginning, or actually it's ongoing, and there are a few others on our website, so check those out. Our speaker today is Joe Ikley. He speaks today from North Dakota State University. He has been working with the use of herbicides, cover crops, and weed seed retention to manage herbicide-resistant weeds. I'm sure we'll learn about that in a few minutes. His background includes extension and research programs at Purdue University and the University of Maryland. Joe is on the board of directors as a communications editor for the North Central Weed Science Society. So with Joe, we welcome you here. And thank you for being part of our Crop Protection Network series.
Good morning, thank you.
All right, so I'm going to pull up your slides here so that you can share them when you are ready.
All right. And just checking, we're looking at my title slide here.
Yep, all looks good. Take it away.
Okay, thank you. And again, thank you to the Crop Protection Network for the opportunity to present today. So a few kind of opening comments I wanted to make here. So obviously I know this will be a kind of a more national audience than just North Dakota, and so I wanted to put into a little perspective. It's 6 degrees in Fargo right now, so I'm still about a month away from really thinking about making herbicide applications. We're still in the planning phase for addressing the upcoming year, and I know others are probably making herbicide applications as we speak. Maybe someone's sitting in a sprayer cab now for this webinar. So kind of knowing the audience and knowing we've got about 25 minutes, I want to cover some content to leave time for questions. Just going to be making some kind of general overviews, some important things to think about in the year with tight supplies. And also, I want to start with a little bit of that background of why we're having this issue, why we're talking about this topic. So the first thing I wanted to cover, I have to do a shameless plug here. So if you're into podcasts, I'm part of one. It's called the War Against Weeds podcast. It's with my colleagues Sarah Lancaster at Kansas State and Mandy Bishop, University of Missouri. One of the main reasons I am plugging this right now is that we do have a couple episodes, one from back in January, one about October timeframe, where we spend about half hour to 45 minutes discussing additional details on product shortages and some considerations for this year. So that's one place you can turn for some additional information about this topic today. So again, I said I want to give a little bit of background, but not spend too much time on why we're really looking at some shortages, what's gotten us to this point. And a lot of these issues can be traced back about 2 years to the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. As far as some port shutdowns, issues with shipping, issues with labor. This is my short list here of issues or reasons why we have some potential shortages and issues in the supply chain. A couple that I want to point out specifically that are really impacting herbicide availability would be this flooding in Germany that cut off some road transport around a glufosinate plant. This hurricane Louisiana shut down a glyphosate plant for a few weeks back in the fall, and then there was also a plant in India that exploded sometime last year that produces herbicides and other pesticides. So in addition to the global issues we're seeing with supply chains in general, there are a few specific issues related to why some herbicides are in short supply. And just wanted to pull up a couple headlines here from the past couple weeks. And so we've been talking about this probably for the last 6 to 9 months, but it seems like every week we see just an additional thing that we know it certainly doesn't help the situation pop up in the news. So a couple weeks ago here in Fargo, we had someone mentioning that the estimate is we're about 80,000 truck drivers short in the US. So again, having issues just getting product around. I think we're all aware of this headline from a couple weeks ago about this force majeure that Bayer declared. Now it seems like this is probably more affecting the South American market, but certainly when we see headlines pop up, it just kind of leads to a little bit more uncertainty about getting the products that we want for this year. And that's where I want to switch to next, is talking about some of the products that we've been talking about and some of the things that I'm hearing currently to date, certainly in my geography, and probably pretty applicable to most on here today as well. So I'm going to say the big two that we certainly need to concern ourselves with would be glyphosate and glufosinate. And so just as a way of comparison, I talked to some distributors around North Dakota the past couple of days. Where we can get these products, we're looking at about 2 to 2.5x markup in price compared to this time last year. And that's also going to be more expensive than this time 24 months ago. And so where we can get products, we're expecting to pay more. And so that alone, just due to price, has people looking elsewhere for some other alternative herbicides or alternative weed control considerations. Besides the big two, the ones that I would call the next up are Group 1 herbicides that we use for grass control in some of our broadleaf crops, things like clethodim and quizalofop. As people are trying to figure out how to navigate a world without all the glyphosate they want for grass control and crops, we're starting to put a pretty big squeeze on the Group 1 herbicides, and those prices are increasing and supply is getting tighter. And then if we go down the line, this is really just kind of a trickle-down effect, and we're seeing other herbicides now in tight demand as we look at different weed control programs throughout the year. So certainly some premixes that have glyphosate available in them, products like Halix GT or Sequence, is one way we had talked about all winter of how to get your glyphosate needs, and now some of those may be in some tight supply. And some are Group 15 herbicides that we use for residual control of grasses and broadleaf weeds, and even some products like atrazine. We're starting to see the squeeze on those as people figure out other weed control programs to help just figure out weed control if you can't get your glyphosate or glufosinate needs. So what can we do about it? And this may be one of the most important slides of the presentation this morning. Again, being to more of a national audience, the top 2 bullet points I think are very important. So we can make some sweeping recommendations, but some of these issues will be pretty local, whether it's due to your weed issues, the crops you're planting, whether the supply chain loosens up in a month or two. There's a couple of different things that are going to make it regional possibilities as far as the issues. And so utilize those local resources, whether it's your extension, industry, agronomist, whoever you kind of talk to and rely on for recommendations. Again, those do vary by region, and so an example I like to give is using a Group 1 herbicide in a burndown situation for controlling grass weeds ahead of planting a crop. That's not a recommendation I would make up here in North Dakota based on our cool spring burndown window, but I know it's annual recommendation in some areas of the country for controlling grasses, and so that's why it's difficult for me to make a sweeping recommendation, and we do need to focus on some region specificity for some situations. The third bullet point there, supply prices will vary by region. I want to point out that's not just saying the Northern Great Plains versus the southeast part of the U.S. Even within the county I'm sitting in, I can go to a few different elevators and get different prices, different supply availability. And so certainly having conversations to get the products you need is going to be an important point of consideration. And this bottom one is just always important to me on an annual basis, but knowing the weeds you're actually trying to control in different fields, if you do have to use different herbicides, know the strengths and weaknesses of those herbicides on the weeds you're trying to control. And weed pressure within the field could dictate your product choice as well. So if you have a field with a heavy weed infestation and you have enough glufosinate to only cover a certain percentage of your fields, maybe you target all your glufosinate on the heavy weed pressure fields. If you have fields with lighter weed pressure, then you can use some alternative products that may not be as effective as the ones you prefer to use. So other things, what else can we do to try and manage and navigate our way through this situation? That first bullet point I really just talked about. If we have fields we can prioritize, that we know we're going to need some additional chemical help, or we really want to put something like glufosinate on that field, and we have enough for a certain percentage of fields, prioritizing fields, it was one thing that will certainly help. Cultural practices that weed scientists talk about on an annual basis will also, of course, be of importance this year. So narrow row spacing will lead to quicker canopy closure, maybe reduce the need for an additional post-emergence herbicide. If you have a cover crop out in the field right now, if we can get some biomass accumulation, that helps suppress early season weeds. For strategic tillage, a lot of times we may talk about inter-row cultivation, but if you're planning for a no-till burn-down operation and can't get the product you need for the weeds you have, maybe strategic tillage could be going ahead and conventionally tilling to prepare the seed bed. So certainly think about where you might be able to work tillage into an operation as well. And then another one that's of course of importance is managing your major agronomic issues. Soybeans in my neck of the woods, we get a lot of iron deficiency chlorosis. We can manage that with some different products. We can manage that with cultivar selection. And so basically anything we can do to help our crops along and get to crop canopy will help overall with weed management. When we go down and look at herbicides specifically, using either a full rate of herbicide will be important. And then when we need to, switching or pivoting to alternative herbicides are some of the ways we can get through this year. So focusing on these alternative herbicide considerations, what are some of the things to consider? And I'm going to point out basically the burn down and post-emergence timings. So we had the supply issue, some tight supplies, increased prices on a lot of the herbicides we use for burn down and post-emergence markets. For the most part, not so much for some of the pre-emergence or residual herbicides. So I'm going to focus again just this morning on alternative uses in burn down and for post-emergence. Just knowing that we do have several alternatives that can be effective, but for both of those, it will depend on your crop and your weed spectrum on how effective some of these alternatives can be. And ultimately, knowing not just alternative product limitations, but even whichever herbicide you're using, knowing their limitations, just because we know how valuable that post-emergence application will be this year. So I'm going to focus first a few specific points about burn down herbicides prior to planting, and then we'll switch and talk about a few other topics to round out the half hour. So the first thing I want to point out, so I have just a number of different products here on the screen. And this is not going to be a comprehensive list of products that we could use in a burn down situation. It's pretty comprehensive for my geography, but as you go further south, get into different crops, of course, these products can change. And I've basically grouped these into four major groupings for today's purpose. The top three are just the different site of action herbicides to generalize a couple of group 22 or photosystem 1 inhibitors, some of our group 14 or PPO inhibiting products, and then there's group 4 or synthetic auxin products as well. The bottom ones are simply products that can be used in burn down situations, and the utility of those products will vary by region. And as I mentioned before, a group 1 herbicide, a glufosinate for burn down, I'm not going to recommend in my geography, but southern states may be a little bit different on those recommendations there. So a couple of things I want to point out with these group 4 herbicides. We're all pretty familiar with dicamba, 2,4-D, some of us with haloxifene methyl. Just keeping in mind that those are broadleaf herbicides we can use ahead of certain crops, and that will also vary by region, primarily rainfall patterns, for instance, where 2,4-D and dicamba ahead of some crops up here are not an option for me, but will be an option in southern states. To focus in a little bit more, I do want to spend a slide talking about these Group 22 and Group 14 products, since I think they will probably get a lot of utility in areas where we can't use glyphosate in Burndown this year. So again, focusing now specifically on these Group 22 or photosystem 1 inhibiting herbicides, some general comments I would make for both paraquat and diaquat are that they will always benefit from the addition of a photosystem 2 inhibitor, a product like atrazine or metribuzin. So we have known for a number of years now that tank mixes of paraquat and metribuzin or paraquat and atrazine are synergistic and provide additional weed control. So when you can ahead of crops, I would certainly recommend an atrazine or a metribuzin be tank mixed with these Group 22 herbicides. Again, where you can in front of certain crops, the addition of a 2,4-D or a dicamba will also just enhance or broaden the broadleaf weed control that we can expect as well. So a consideration there as well, where we can work it into a program. And then something that I'll be talking about a little bit more detail later in the post-emergence applications, but certainly optimizing our spray applications for the herbicides we're using. If you're used to relying on glyphosate for your burn down needs, you may use larger droplets, lower carrier volumes. These Group 22 herbicides and the Group 14 herbicides on the next slide, we're going to want smaller droplets and higher carrier volumes because they are contact herbicides, and we need coverage to get the best weed control that we can. So looking at the two products specifically, paraquat would be my choice out of this mode of action. Of course, non-selective herbicide, excellent on broadleaf weeds. Can get some very good grass control if annual grasses are small. Once they get some size to them, then we will see some slips and not get the best control we would want. Diquat, and this may be regional here, but I kind of mentioned it to North Dakota folks as I would call it an honorary mention as a product. It's a Group 22 herbicide that does have some great utility, but comparing it to paraquat in a burn down situation, I would prefer paraquat. I'm not going to recommend diquat over paraquat just because of the better weed control in general, especially in burn down situations from paraquat. Shifting to focus again on these Group 14 herbicides, just to show some of the strengths and weaknesses. We'll talk a little bit more about adjuvants with post-emergence chemistry, but when it comes to these products specifically, MSO will be the adjuvant of choice. So all of these Group 14 herbicides mention MSO as a preferred adjuvant. If you don't have MSO in the tank, and even if you go to a crop oil, you'll still get activity, but MSO will give us the best activity in this class of chemistry as far as foliar activity on a weed. And most of these we will also benefit from having AMS in the tank. And again, contact herbicides, so we have to get our sprayer set up, optimized for these ones. Focusing a little bit on the active ingredients themselves. So saflufenicil we've had for over a decade now. Some important points that I would like to make about saflufenicil are that we do see a synergistic reaction with glyphosate on some of our glyphosate-resistant weeds even. So the classic example we'd use is we might use saflufenicil on horseweed or mare's tail, problematic weed that we have to control in burn down applications. A lot of glyphosate resistance across the U.S. Saflufenicil by itself is pretty effective on horseweed, but it's going to be even better with glyphosate in the tank. So if we can get some glyphosate to tank mixes with saflufenicil, we'll just overall have better control for burn down. The main thing here with something like saflufenicil is it's going to need help on grasses. So does not have a whole lot of activity on grasses. Tiafenicil is a product that was new to the market as of last year. So some may have some experience with this product. It's in the same chemical family as saflufenicil, is a very similar chemical. Some of the initial research we have, it's in general, I'd say it's pretty equivalent on some of our broadleaf weeds. And for us, weeds like common lamb's quarters and wild buckwheat looks very similar to saflufenicil. One specific weakness we found up here is it's not as good as saflufenicil on kochia. So there are some subtle differences for broadleaf weeds. In general, it is better on grass, has better grass control than saflufenicil. but I'm not going to say that's necessarily an endorsement for this as a grass product. It's still going to greatly benefit from the addition of a grass herbicide and glyphosate. Of course, most years is what we would tank mix with this, but we're just going to point out we can get some grass activity, but it's not going to be complete control in a lot of situations. And the last one here, carfentrazone, we'll get utility out of this in a burn down oftentimes in the northern Great Plains. If we're focusing on 1 to 1.5 inch kochia, wild buckwheat, other broadleaf weeds. Most people may not like using this product if you're used to trying to control larger weeds and have a different weed spectrum than some of the broadleaf weeds that we're certainly going after in the northern Great Plains. So again, for time, just kind of want to focus in on some specific differences with some of those burn down alternatives. So if we've gotten through a successful burn down or just use tillage to control that first flush of weeds before planting, now what are some considerations as we get further into the season? And for me, some of these are kind of our golden standards that weed scientists mention every year, but we need to focus on our residual herbicides. We need to focus on using multiple effective active ingredients for the weeds that we're trying to control. And for this is again goes back to some of these scouting tips I mentioned earlier. We need to know the weeds, and also we need to know the resistance to different herbicides that the weeds in your field have. And that will help us select the proper, the best residual herbicides for certain fields. And then using full rates, and I'll mention here, but show an example later, that full rates are sometimes higher than you think they are for some of our residual herbicides. And again, I'll focus in on specifically on that here in another couple of slides. So when I talk about residual herbicides, I love showing this picture. This was a picture taken by Travis Legleiter, who's now a weed scientist at Kentucky. This was when we were both grad students together at Purdue. And this is, I think, just a great picture showing the value of a residual herbicide. And so we know there's a number of different combinations that we can use ahead of our different crops. And I really like this picture because it does show just the range of response we can get. And so this is a bunch of different products on Palmer Amaranth. And we can see kind of here in the front of the screen, we have basically an untreated check compared to something that might be 70% control. Compared to some of the other small plots behind further back in this picture, completely clean from Palmer Amaranth. And so just the range of responses, that's where we need to focus in on knowing the weeds, finding the right product combinations to give us the best residual control we can get, knowing that products like glufosinate will be in short supply and we may have issues acquiring those for in-season weed control. So again, another data slide here from Purdue from some of the research when I was there as a student. This slide is pretty busy, but I want to point out some of the main things that I talk about on this slide is that we're looking at about 28 different pre-emergence herbicides. And these numbers on the graph, as we go from left to right, those are the site of action of the herbicides in the program that are effective on this Palmer Amaranth population. And so we've grouped them as we go from left to right as we add more effective sites of action. So on the left, some of these products are only one effective site of action versus the right side of the screen. We have up to 3 effective sites of action. And what I want to show for control, so this is just a 0 to 100% scale for visual control. Many of these products on the left side of the screen, we may have from 50 to 90% control, but we have these large error bars showing that there's quite a bit of variability across years in control from these products. When we get to the right side of the screen, in general, we're about 90% to 100% control out of these products here on the right side of the screen, where we have more effective sites of action, and in general, smaller error bars. So basically more consistent control where we get more effective sites of action onto that field. So that was just a quick data slide on effective sites of action. I do want to show this for full rates of herbicides. And here I'm going to pick on the Sonic and Authority First products just to show this example. And so when we think of a full rate of a herbicide, if we think of a product like Sonic or Authority First, many of us may be in this 4 to 5 ounce range that we would typically apply at planting, and then we'll come back 3, 4, or 5 weeks later with their post-emergence programs. Well, if you actually dig into the label, a full rate of this residual product, if you're on less than 3% organic matter, is 6.45 ounces. If you have more than 3, 8 ounces of product is actually the full rate that we can use according to the label. So I point this out again because if we don't have the products that we want post-emergence, we can often apply a little bit more product than we may be used to applying for residual. So really, the products you're using, dig into the labels, make sure, if you can, use the full rate possible, which again just may be higher than you're thinking it might be. Okay, a couple notes on post-emergence herbicides, and then we'll kind of wrap this thing up and get into the Q&A. So a couple general notes for these post-emergence herbicides, knowing that we may only get one shot, so we want to get it right this year. Oftentimes we may be able to get 2 applications of glufosinate on a field. I doubt that's going to be the case unless you won the lottery this year. So other things we can do is be on top of your application game, optimize that sprayer setup, be on top of your adjuvant game, make sure you have the correct adjuvants for the herbicides you're using, and make sure you are using full rates of these adjuvants as well. And then I'll have a slide at the end, but be aware of antagonistic combinations. So if we're tank mixing different post-emergence herbicides together, we don't want those to antagonize each other and compromise weed control. So here's a picture I've shown to my audiences up here for the past couple of years. So this was a field I was called to, general poor control on water hemp with glufosinate. I like to show this picture because it's also kind of a fun interaction here. We did have some clean rows in this field, and basically this field was sprayed when it was pretty wet, and so there's clean rows of the tire track. So if nothing else, if you don't get the product you need, maybe you can just drive a full sprayer up and down each row and control all your weeds that way. But most of us are probably not going to want to do that. And so as far as optimizing applications, the main issue in this field that I walked in that particular year was the water hemp was probably 6 inches at application, so too large. And so part of optimizing our application is making sure the weeds are the right size when we spray our herbicides on them. And there's other things that we can do to optimize applications as well. So here's a slide from Brian Young at Purdue. This is a demo he put together a number of years ago, showing the utility of ammonium sulfate and then the correct droplet size for glufosinate. So this is on a Palmer amaranth population. The left side here is a good application. So ammonium sulfate as an adjuvant, the correct droplet spectrum, the right nozzles and carrier volume. Just going with something besides ammonium sulfate and using the incorrect droplet spectrum was seeing a 40% reduction in control of Palmer. So again, just showing that we can get some good utility out of the chemistry that we have, and if you have a short supply of glufosinate, want to optimize that, then we certainly need to optimize our application. Quick note on adjuvants, just want to show this data slide. When you're using herbicides, and this is just an example with Lautis and different adjuvant classes, that we can get different responses on whether it's a grass or a broadleaf weed, and certainly different herbicide active ingredients based on adjuvant class. So knowing the correct adjuvants for the herbicides you're applying will help. And then just one quick note here on antagonism, data slide for controlling glyphosate-resistant volunteer corn. Same concept would apply to grasses. So we know our group 1 herbicides like clethodim, quizalofop, and 2,4-D and dicamba are antagonistic. And we see this quite readily on volunteer corn. And so here's just a data slide from up here in Fargo. Basically what we're seeing are 3 different group 1 products. The left crossed bar is the product at a low rate applied by itself. And then the red, yellow, and green bar are that same product at the low, a medium, and a high rate for the group 1 herbicide. Plus, in this case, 2 pints of Enlist 1, so about a pound of 2,4-D. And just showing for control of volunteer corn, once we get into these tank mixes, we basically have to go to a high rate and in many cases double the rate for the same amount of control as if we had that that group 1 herbicide applied by itself. So just be aware of these antagonistic interactions. You can overcome this oftentimes by using a higher rate of a group 1 herbicide, or splitting out the application and applying the group 1 and the group 4 herbicide separately. So last slide here, just one I stole from Brian Young, just wanting to again kind of tie everything together here. And so there are things that we can manage that we need to manage this year. And that's our herbicides, the rates and adjuvants that we use, and of course optimizing our sprayer, all the things, carrier volume, travel speed, boom height, didn't mention. We want to control these things and optimize them the best that we can, because there's things that we won't be able to control. Weed height, the weed species, the environment that we don't know what the weather is going to be doing when we're making these applications. So again, just an overall theme for the year: control the things that we can to help us manage the things that we can't control. And with that, there's just some contact information, and I'll be happy to take any questions if there are any that were popped into the box.
All right, Joe, excellent. Yes, we have a number of questions. Let's do 2 of them. One of them, I think, touches on what you just talked about how you can control the timing of when you apply. So the question was, if you were planning to use a group 15 on soybean, both pre and post, but you don't have enough for both applications, which timing of application would you go with?
Oh yes, that's a great question. That's again, that's in some ways maybe regional, depending on the weed you're going after. I'm just going to make the assumption this is going after a water hemp or a palmer amaranth population. In general, if you're going to go with some wider row soybeans, and I guess I would, if you only have enough to cover once, maybe save that group 15 for that post-emergence application to get that added residual to get you to a crop canopy, knowing we have some group 14 and group 5 products that we can use at planting. So if you have enough for once, then maybe save that for that second, and make sure you use the other residual herbicides at planting.
Okay. Another question quick is, could you share your thoughts or experience with using Cobra as a replacement for Liberty?
Yeah, so thoughts for Cobra in place of Liberty. And so a few things there. And so you're going to, of course, the nozzles should be about the same. Adjuvants, AMS or UAN will be pretty good for Cobra. Using a crop oil will also be essential as well. Other things of consideration: you're going to expect some more crop injury, but in most cases the soybeans recover quite quickly, even in up here where we get a little bit more arid. As far as weed spectrum themselves, both products, you want smaller weeds. Liberty or glufosinate, you can get some grass control, especially things like giant foxtail. You might get some good giant foxtail control if they're small with glufosinate. Do not expect that with Cobra. There's going to be some other weed-specific differences. Most of the weeds that I'll be looking at up here, they're going to be pretty similar, but Liberty or glufosinate might be a little bit better on something like kochia than Cobra would be. So again, that's where some regional conversations may help, just comparing the two and knowing your expectations.
Okay, sound advice all around. Thank you everyone for attending. Again, this webinar recording will be available. Watch your email within about a week or 2. And Joe, thanks so much for joining us today. And everyone, you can see his contact information if you have further questions. And
Yep,
I will see you next time.
Feel free to reach out on email or Twitter if you have follow-up questions. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Yep, thanks everyone, and goodbye.